The coronavirus crisis has cut Australia off from the world, and our population growth is about to slow dramatically. Net migration to Australia stood at 240,000 people last financial year in 2018-19. In the current financial year, it's thought it's going to drop by about 80,000 people, and it'll drop by over 200,000 people next financial year in 2020-21. Now, these are very significant falls that are going to affect our property markets and is going to slow economic growth by up to 2%. But as happens every time we have an economic downturn, immigration becomes a topic of great interest. There are questions such as, should Australia still continue its skilled immigration program, and maybe we should cut back on allowing temporary visas, those work visas that allow young people to come here and take jobs. This discussion has become even more vocal with the likelihood that unemployment is going to increase to over 10%. So in today's show, I'm going to discuss immigration and the political implications, the economic implications, the property implications with my regular guest, Simon Kuestenmacher, who's one of Australia's leading demographers. In fact, you're going to be surprised what his research suggests is going to happen to immigration when we look back in a decade's time. So if you're interested in property investment, or if you're in business of any sort or a profession, what we're going to share today will help you shape some of the decisions you're going to have to make moving forward. Simon always has great insights, and I'm sure you're going to agree that today's chat's no different. So, welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's most trusted property commentator who has once again been voted Australia's leading property investment advisor. That's the fifth time he's won a similar award in the last 7 years.
There's no doubt that the COVID-19 virus and its rapid spread around the world has greatly impacted our lives. To date, much of the commentary about COVID-19 is focused on health issues and the effect of our lockdown on our economy. Of course, there are good reasons for this, but what impact will there be on our population growth? What trends will there be post the coronavirus environment? That's what I'm going to be talking about today with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. Simon's a director of research at the Demographics Group. He's a columnist with The Australian, and Simon's become globally recognised as a rising star in the field of data management, and he's a regular guest on my podcast. So welcome, Simon.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Simon, I love talking about demographics because I know we both believe that demographics is going to determine our future. If we know what demographic changes are ahead, that can help us plan as investors and as business people. And over the years, immigration has been a key driver of Australia's population growth and therefore our economic growth. But what's going to happen now that our borders are closed? The coronavirus is driving the biggest population decline in Australia's history. I've read you commenting that there's 300,000 tourists, temporary workers, students already departing Australia, and that threatens to deepen the consumer spending slump that we're starting to get. And a lot of the people listening to this are interested in our housing markets as well. But Simon, I read your great article in The Australian where you attempted to estimate what could happen in the longer term. So while a lot of people are talking about, this month, next month, this year, what's the long-term consequences? What are your findings?
Well, the idea was that we always have very good population projections in Australia, and they were very, very precise in the past simply because we were used to run, and I guess still do, run a skilled migration program. That means we take in as many skilled migrants as the economy demands. And so there is a tap on that. So we always said, well, we'll allow 180,000, 250,000 people, whatever it is per year into the economy. We knew this years in advance. So we knew really well who is coming in, when they're coming in. We know the age that they are of because migrants either come as skilled migrants, that means they're between 22 and 37 largely, or they come as international students, which means they are largely between 18 and 22. So we knew exactly how many people came into Australia or are going to come into Australia and what age they were. And then we kind of know how many kids they will have. And we could then predict the Australian population 10 years into the future to a really high degree of accuracy. That kind of went down the drain with COVID-19, since all of a sudden we have to assume that for 2020, for the rest of the year, we'll have essentially no migration intake. We even have people leaving because there were so many people working in Australia on temporary visas, and they had to go back to their home countries because they had no employment in Australia. And so their visa ran out. They had to return. So we saw a population decline so far in Australia this year. And this will have impacts for years to come. And that's what we've tried to understand. We've done a bit of scenario modeling in order to put a number to this. And that is, of course, a speculative exercise. But I think it's really important to understand this as a general concept if you are into real estate investing, if you are into any kind of investing, really.
Well, I think it's important for governments to do their planning, for businesses to do their planning, big businesses and small businesses, and clearly for Australians who are interested in property investment and just what's happening to the real estate market, because it's going to affect the value of your house as well. So what variables did you consider when you did this study, Simon?
So the first thing you have to assume is that we have no migration intake for the whole year of 2020. And we then also have to take into account that a certain number of people are leaving Australia. So we got 2020 down pat. But our goal is to get an understanding of Australia by 2030, 10 years into the future. We then can understand that probably we'll have for another year very, very low migration. And we do know that after a pandemic, there is always a lowering of the birth rate occurring, simply because people are anxious. We hear sometimes in the media or on the radio jokingly referred to as the corona baby boom, where people are stuck at home and they will have nothing else to do than to create babies.
It's the opposite, isn't it? That's actually not what experience shows you because, hey, I don't want to take on extra expenses at the moment. I'm a bit unsure what's going to happen moving forward.
Exactly. In order to make sure that you can financially support a family or another member of a family, you need to be very optimistic about your own future. And in an environment where my income is cut down a bit, my job is less secure, maybe I don't have a job, then I was simply not adding another person to my family. And we live in a time of easily to handle birth control. So this will not be the case. So we will see probably, we ran several models, and in our model, we assumed 3 years of lower birth rates, and then it goes back to normal once people feel more confident about their own future again. We also had to take into account that migration will probably start up slowly, but then after, we said 4 years, we don't know whether this is exactly right, it will pick up to pre-COVID-19 numbers, and then Australia continues to grow. So the idea is that by 2030, compared to 2019, which is the year we have the last official data for, Australia will grow. Quite beautifully, Australia will grow. So we don't need to worry too much. We will add almost 4 million people in that time frame, but that is still 1 million less than we could have added otherwise.
So we're missing 1 million, but there's one other variable I know you took into account that you left out, maybe because I'm a bit older, you didn't want to offend me, the death rate. I guess you would have had to take that into account as well.
Exactly. We did need to understand COVID-19, which kills off largely the older population. But so far, Australia has been handling the pandemic beautifully. We managed to get through this with very, very few deaths. That means from a statistical perspective, we don't need to alter the death rate assumptions, which is the main goal. It's quite wonderful that we can actually do our calculations without having to take this into account. Big success.
So interestingly, you said there's going to be 1 million people less in 2030, in a decade's time, than originally planned. Now, that sounds like a big number, but on the other hand, you said there's also going to be, 4 million more people.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's the understanding that we are still operating in a country that has seen really high population growth of around 400,000 people per year. That is an unheard number for a Western industrialized country, which is really helpful. And we still have plenty of room to grow. So every now and then we get a misunderstanding around Australia being full. Australia is a big continent occupied by only 25 million people so far.
The other problem is around these times, especially when unemployment rises, there's always the discussion about should we limit immigration. That seems to come up every time there's a bit of a downturn.
Oh, and it's an understandable reflex where you see arguments being thrown out. I'm unemployed. Why should we take more people in that are taking my jobs? That's always the fear. But we need to understand that the way that we take migrants into Australia is we take them in on based on the skilled migration list, which is just this list that gets constantly updated, and it dictates the type of jobs that are not available. So we don't have the workers for these jobs, but the economy has the demand for those jobs. So therefore, we do know that in an environment over the next year or two, where we've seen lots of very highly skilled people being unemployed, the demand of the labor market to fill jobs will be able to be filled with the people that are already in Australia. But in a year plus, we will hit the wall again. We will not have the talent in the country that we need in order to grow the economy. And then we will update the skilled migration list and we will take those people into Australia. We will then, of course, need to understand whether these people will still want to come to Australia, whether Australia still has the pulling power to get international talent into the country. And I would always argue we still continue to have this very much over the next decade or so.
Well, the other thing is that some of these skilled jobs take time to develop the skills. So it's not as easy as for me to redeploy to learn something new. It may take 3-4 years to learn those skills. And our economy can't wait that long to get a kickstart again, can it?
No, it certainly can't. And that's everybody's goal here. And if you think about the Job Keeper program, that's the main idea, is that you actually pay unemployment benefits while people are still in a job, with the idea that it's then a smoother transition to kickstart back into full gear once there is demand again for whatever the kind of job we're talking about. So it's a rather smart concept in theory. I hope it will actually work out in practice as well.
Yes, I like the idea. So, Simon, it's important to understand the sort of population figures that you mentioned, but I assume it's also important to understand the generational split, the demographics of this missing million.
Absolutely. And the missing million, of course, is largely driven. So we mentioned this before. We have a lower birth rate. So that means that there are fewer babies. Babies over the next couple of years are officially belonging to Gen Alpha. These are the people that are born after 2018. So every baby being born at the moment is a Gen Alpha. We'll be missing out on quite a few of those because people that are currently in Australia are a bit fearful about the future. They don't want to have another kid in the family. Then, of course, the migrants that we're missing out on, the people that would be between, well, really then the childbearing ages of the life cycle. So they might have added kids to Australia. So those potential kids aren't there and those migrants aren't there. So what that means in practical terms is we are missing out on the biggest chunk of the missing million, almost 500,000 people. Essentially, these are the Gen Zs, the people born, that's the Greta Thunberg generation, the people that are right now still at university, that are coming of age, born between 2000, 2017, this up and coming generation, which is a shame that we're missing out on this. It's a very highly educated generation that has a lot to add to the world. So we're missing out on those. We're also missing out 22%, or what would this be? 200,000 people of Gen Y, of the millennials. But nonetheless, over the 2020s, if we look at this, where we say, okay, we largely miss out on Gen Ys, Gen Zs, and Gen Alphas, and 5% of Gen X and baby boomers combined. So very few of the older populations we're missing out on. That has a lot of implications for the power balances in Australia. So we say that the values that are driving Australia are, of course, linked to the generations in a rough way. So that means that those really progressive, world-centric values that Gen Z brings forward, they're actually not as strong in the future as they could have been. That means that the baby boomer generation, for example, they are still relatively larger than they would have been in other terms. So it does have implications if we have to predict the political direction of a country. So if you will, we could say we are probably by 2030 a bit more conservative now after COVID than we could have been without COVID.
Okay, so also if you're a business owner, I guess it affects a particular demographic, especially if you're aiming your business at younger people and children. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. So the good news is that if you have a product that you're selling that is targeting, let's say, people between 0 and 18, so every child care product, every kind of school product, they will still see significant growth compared to 2019, even now that we cut out 1 million people. So that's wonderful. So nobody in this business end, kindergarten through to secondary school, need to be worried. The cohort that will actually see population decline in 2030 compared to 2019 are the people aged 22 to 28. This is the Gen Z generation that by 2030 then will be in that age group. And that is really bad news for an industry that is particularly focusing on this age group. And the number one industry that I can think of there are universities. Universities almost exclusively deal with people in their early to mid 20s. So if we see that is going back as a university, universities need to come up with different ideas how they make money. And I would predict that the obvious direction for university throughout the 2020s is to really double down on postgraduate education, not necessarily the expensive and long-term commitments of a master's degree or a PhD, but rather short-term executive education, where you're not just selling knowledge, but you're selling networking power. That's what an MBA is. Nobody learns anything practical in an MBA. People get the network sold in an MBA.
I've never heard it put that way, but that's exactly right, because I know a few people who've done an MBA. I'm not sure they've come out any cleverer, but yes, they've got some different ideas. So when we look at the property market, that also will mean that that group of people who would normally be leaving home and probably not buying property, but starting to rent property, sometimes around universities, but other times just with friends because they're going to want to work close to the CBD, live close to the CBD, there'll be a little bit of a gap of that moving forward as well.
Oh, absolutely. So it's the rental market. That's exactly the age when you live in a rental product, but probably not live at home anymore. That's difficult. We do know from the international student market, of course, in Australia, many international students live in what is called purpose-built student accommodation. They expected an awful lot of growth for the next 2 years. They will now see significant decline. So that means there is tons of buildings in the pipeline that will stay unoccupied. So that's a very dangerous part of the property market at the moment. And you would think and hope that they are able to pivot, that they are able to realign their service offering and probably reach other cohorts, you'd hope.
So, Simon, we've spoken about the long-term consequences that over the next decade, while we are going to still have substantial population growth, it'll be probably about 1 million less than initially anticipated by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. But there's also, let's talk a bit about the short term, what's going to happen, because there's been the discussions about how this will affect our businesses, our consumer spending, the real estate markets, and our economy. And when we dig into the Australian Bureau of Statistics figures, they show that there's a lot of temporary visas. They, in fact, accounted for 63.4% of overseas migrants, with 118,000 of those coming on temporary visas for higher education. So a lot of the temporary visas were education, and then there was others in various industries, Simon.
Yes. So when we think about those temporary visa holders that we are missing out on in Australia in the short term because they're leaving, they, of course, will be extracted from the housing market. So we need to understand where they tend to cluster. And international students quite clearly cluster near the universities. And the universities in Australia still tend to cluster largely in our biggest cities. In Melbourne and Sydney is where we have the largest education hubs. We will see international students moving away from there. They overwhelmingly live in purpose-built student accommodation. This is a housing product that is specifically targeted at international students and is usually occupied by them because they can book this housing option from overseas. So the international parent that lets their 18-year-old kid leave the house for the first time, they don't need to worry about their kid being unemployed. That's the problem that the purpose-built student accommodation is solving. Now, they, of course, had housing in the pipeline as well, more housing because international student numbers were supposed to grow. Now they're going to decline. That is a whole sector that is struggling. So we have a sector of the inner city that is struggling with to fill the occupancies. And also the skilled migrants that hold temporary visas, they're usually sponsored by some big company that has the ability and the financial strength to sponsor a migrant to work for them. And so when these jobs are extracted from Australia, that will also impact the housing market near these employment centers, because when an international skilled migrant comes to Melbourne, comes to Sydney, they don't know how the city operates. All they know is the address of their employer, of the university. So their initial housing option in Australia will be quite likely as close as possible or as close as affordable to that job, to that university. And then you take this away from this inner city market in the short run. So right now is an opportunity to get into the inner city market if you want to go into it. And it was used to be unaffordable. Once education kicks up again, once migration kicks up again, it will be exactly these inner city areas that will see the highest demand, simply because we will still have jobs and still have universities in those areas located.
It'll be interesting to see if people are still happy to live in those little boxes without big windows and without fresh air and sharing corridors with people. That's a whole different discussion about what our lives are going to look like post-COVID. But at the moment, there's a lot of news in the media about immigration and what it's going to do and should we limit it. But Australia introduced post-war immigration after the Second World War, I remember, on the concept of populate or perish. And that was necessary at the time. We needed to grow our economy by growing people. And immigrants and their extended families came here to help fill the labour shortages, to help build our nation and help grow our economy. So, Simon, how important is the population growth on keeping our economy moving, and how much of an effect are we going to have, a negative effect are we going to have on our economy with these decreased short-term immigration numbers?
We will definitely see a hit on our economy because we really rely on migrants to grow our economy. And what I always like to point out is that the big numbers that we take into Australia have been responsible for driving the housing market, for driving the construction market. So it means that the jobs that are servicing the property industry and the construction industry that are largely middle-skilled, middle-class jobs, they would be suffering the most or will be suffering the most in a time where we have decreased immigration. When we take away migration in Australia, it's not the people on the top that suffer. It's not even the people on the bottom that suffer. It's the middle class that really depends on a high migration intake. Our oversight in terms of migration in Australia over the last, let's call it 2 decades, really was that we didn't grow infrastructure at the same rate as we grew migration. That is an unexcusable mistake that we've done. And we have to live with this, but we can correct this. And the wonderful news is that government can correct this by spending more on infrastructure and by really doubling down on infrastructure spending across the whole of Australia. You create middle-skilled jobs. It's the easiest way to create jobs at will in Australia. Government can do this. And it will happen because right now we need this job boost. Or not right now, by the end of the year, really. We will see more and more infrastructure programs kick in so that we get the Australian middle class back into work.
I think there's other benefits for infrastructure spending as well. We use local resources, we create local work, as you said, but it also leaves a legacy for the future. So that's nice rather than digging things out of the ground and sending them off overseas.
Absolutely. It's the idea of leaving a legacy as a government. I think that's fun. I'm always joking around that it is very interesting to have a liberal government at the moment that discovered the joy of spending like a Labour government. And it's
Yes, that's true. Look what's happened. But with this fall in temporary migration, it's not going to affect Australia evenly, is it? As we've already suggested, the majority of these people are coming to New South Wales and Victoria.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that in a healthy non-COVID year, migrants go first to New South Wales, then they go to Victoria. That's by far the largest entrance points into Australia, the launchpad suburbs. People then, migrants, once they've been here a couple of years in Sydney, in Melbourne, they actually do travel to other cities as well, or move to other cities as well. But it will be those big cities, Melbourne and Sydney, funnily enough, very, very counterintuitively, that will not be hit the hardest by migration. So migration actually works like a trickle-down mechanism, where the most migrants go into Melbourne and Sydney, and then they go into small towns. So when you take migrants away, they will still go into the big towns, but they will stay away from the really small towns. So it is your small Horsham, your small Portland, your Wangaratta, these little towns that are actually hit significantly harder in percentage terms than Melbourne or Sydney would be. So there is the whole discussion about how the regional cities react to the changing population dynamics post-COVID.
Now, Simon, I know we've discussed it briefly in a previous podcast, but I think it's worth repeating that permanent migrants don't take Australian jobs. If anything, they create jobs for others.
Exactly. That is actually the definition of the skilled migration program, is that when you take in skilled migrants, you actually have to prove that there is not enough labor available in Australia. And then once you made this argument, what you actually do say, well, we don't have enough aeronautical engineers. You put the job on the list, you allow for 1,000 of those, and then they come in, and then you take it off the list. It's just that simple.
So it's a bit of a shock absorber, which is good. But they also boost local product sales. They need things, they buy things. They're not expensive for the community because they don't need the education of young children or the healthcare of older people. And they, in general, boost the GDP. That's one of the arguments that I guess we've discussed before. What would our GDP be like if there wasn't population growth? But the answer is we can have it. And it'd be nice to think that once we're over all this, the international students are going to come back, holiday makers are going to come back, agriculturalists, those seasonal jobs that the locals just didn't want to do are going to come back. I know Australia's migration program was the envy of a lot of other countries. Up till now, it was a pretty good deal for Australia and for the migrants.
It's a absolutely success story in Australia. The only negative was that we didn't manage to grow infrastructure at scale. That's the sole thing that we've done wrong, and we can fix this. And I'm convinced that Australia will actually fix this time around.
I guess part of the reason we didn't grow the infrastructure is it's really hard if you've got a 3-year or 4-year window of opportunity in your political cycle to spend money on 20 years' time when the legacy is going to be left long after you're gone. But it looks like now we're all banding together from both sides of Parliament, both sides of government, and wanting to build a new, stronger Australia. So I look forward to coming back to you once a month to have these regular chats. And while there are some things in common in some of these chats, I think it's important to understand the significance that demographics is going to have on your future, my future, our business future, and our property market, Simon.
Absolutely. I think this is why I always say demographics are stronger than the coronavirus. Overall, it will be the demographics that are actually driving Australia's future. And we do take a hit. Everyone takes a hit in the world currently because of COVID. But none of our strategic benefits are permanently damaged because of COVID.
And I think the other important thing to remember about demographics is it's not what's happening now. That's why I asked you what's going to happen in 5 and in 10 years' time, because if you know what's going to happen to demographic groups in 5 or 10 years' time, we can plan our businesses, our property markets, how many kindergartens we need, how many old age homes we need as well, because it is really our future that we're looking into.
Absolutely. And I didn't even tell you the best news story from
Yes,
a
please.
demographics perspective for the 2020s. We now finally have the millennials popping into the family formation stage of the life cycle. That is happening. And the millennials that are in the late, or let's call it mid 30s to then in the mid 40s, that's family formation stage. That's when you buy the expensive house that you're going to bring your family up in. This is happening. Millennials procrastinated an awful long time to marry, to have kids, to buy the first home. But we do know very, very reliably that this is happening at scale in the 2020s. And it's a big cohort, a really big cohort that is coming along. It's a big cohort that is going to demand 3-4 bedroom houses. Probably larger houses rather than smaller, because by now we work from home more frequently. Maybe even both partners in a relationship work from home. You have 1.8 kids at home. They need bedrooms. So probably the 4-bedroom market will be in extremely high demand over the next 10 years.
Sure. So the way we live is going to be different, and probably that's worth a discussion next time we catch up. So thank you for your time. I look forward to having you on again real soon on the Michael Yardney podcast.
Oh, thank you. Always a pleasure.
In a moment, I'm going to share my mindset message with you. These seem to be amongst the most popular segments of my show because the reviews we get about them are great. And I hope you're going to enjoy today's show because my message is about hope. Before I get on to that, though, you're probably a little bit confused with what's going on. The message Simon's just giving you the messages out in the world. If there's some uncertainty going through your head, hey, that's pretty normal at the moment. And if you're wondering what's going to happen to property over the next year or two, you're not alone. But you can trust the team at Metropole, my team at Metropole, to provide you with direction, guidance and results. In challenging times like we're currently experiencing, you need an advisor who's going to take a holistic approach to your wealth, and that's exactly what you're going to get from my multi-award winning team at Metropole, because we've got no properties for sale, but we have access to the on-market and the off-market properties. We start off by putting a strategic property plan together for you. We've got our wealth advisory, property management, buyer's agency, renovations, development services that could help you. I don't know what your needs are, so let's find out what you want to achieve, have a chat about how we can help you. Go to metropole.com.au or give us a call at 1300 Metropole. There'll be a link in the show notes.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In today's mindset moment, I'd like to give you some advice if things aren't working out your way. Because things do fall apart. We all have problems. We all have challenges. But there are 3 options you can have when things are falling apart. First of all, you can deny that things are falling apart. Or the second thing you could do is accept that things are falling apart and just add more energy to the same way of doing things. Or the third thing you can do is ask yourself, what's the lesson I need to learn here? The third option is where you stop running from your difficulties or procrastinating on them and open yourself up to the process of falling inwards. This is where transformation occurs. In order for you to grow stronger, parts of you must die. Falling inwards is a place where you go to explore your deeper self, a place where you leave your ego behind and have a crucial conversation about how much longer you're going to tolerate the pain. It's when you realize that you're self-sabotaging the opportunities that you could have if you keep doing what you've been doing. It's when you realise that the business strategy you've had for the last 12 months, the last couple of years, isn't working. It's called hope. Or when you realise that the property investment strategy hasn't gotten you the financial freedom that you've wanted. You're going to have to do things differently. It's when you realise the underlying all this is sometimes fear. It's when you realise that the time you spend fixing things costs you more than moving on. So coming face to face with your darkest self, it can be painful, but it's nowhere near as excruciating as being stuck where you are, being stuck where you don't belong. Sooner or later, you're going to see there's not somebody out there that's causing you suffering. It's something within inside you. You've heard me say these things before regularly in my mentorship programs. Your thoughts lead to your feelings lead to your actions lead to your results. You are where you are now because of all the things you've chosen to do and the things you've chosen not to do. You are the pilot of your life. You're responsible for where you are now. Falling inwards can be the scariest skydiving experience of your life. But what's the alternative? It's actually falling apart. Now that you understand that, which option are you going to choose? As we come to the end of another show, I'd like to ask you a favour. If you got some benefit from today's show, why not tell somebody about it? My mission is to make as many people as financially fluent and successful as possible, and I'd love you to help me by passing on the word through a social media or just tell somebody about the Michael Yardney podcast. If you really enjoyed it, why not leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher or wherever, as Matt Fields recently did. And whether you want to leave a 1-star, 5-star review, I don't mind. I like all the good ones. But if you leave a review and I read it out and you email me, as I'm going to suggest Matt does at michael@metropole.com.au, I'll say thank you to you by gifting you one of my books. Now, Matt said some good investment advice and fundamentals to follow. The guests are great, Pete Wargent, Andrew Wilson, etc. On the downside, there are way too many plugs for his own business. Well, I apologise if you get offended by those, Matt, but let me explain to you that I believe that our services are going to be of benefit for people, and so have tens of thousands of people who've used them over the years. And I believe if I don't tell you about them, I'm doing you a disservice. I'm not ashamed to say that I've educated more successful people in Australia than anyone else, and we've probably bought more properties over the 20 years of our buyers agency than any other company in Australia, and we've advised our clients correctly. But thank you for your honest feedback, and please send us your details so I can say thank you by gifting you one of my books. In the meantime, I'll be back with you again real soon, twice a week on the Michael Yardney podcast. You can keep in contact in between on social media. Just chase up Michael Yardney or with my daily property update newsletter. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?